Our coming noisy space. So if you don't mind, just to come closer and we can have a bit more of a discussion also. So can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. Yeah, and my name is Dina Abdul Fattah. I'm a researcher at the Norwegian Meteorological Institute and the host of this session. So today we'll be talking about from devastation to adaptation and how our changing cryosphere is really impacting communities around the world in very different ways, and also how they're adapting to these very challenging but also innovative perspectives to how to deal with our changing cryosphere. And I really wanted to take a step back because often we hear the word hazard, we hear the combination cryosphere hazards, and that can be quite confusing about what exactly we're talking about in that context. So I will take this definition that is used by the the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And this really looks at the concept of a hazard as something that may happen, right? So it's not the actual risk that's under play, but it's the possibility that a phenomenon can undertake and cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, social economic disruption, and importantly, environmental degradation as well. So as you can see, this definition covers a lot of different aspects. And again, it's about the may cause. So this equation in some ways is really important to keep into mind because a hazard is something that we can prevent from becoming a risk or a disaster. So there is agency in that, as well as exposure and vulnerability, which is really what that whole combination creates what we call disasters at the end of the day. So that's really why we want to look at the local impacts, because there we can better understand what can happen by looking at the full picture. And when we talk about this, often we have a very different scale, right? We hear about sea level rise, we think about the whole world being impacted by glacial and other cryospheric mounts. But there's also very local impacts that can happen from our changing cryosphere. So these are often very immediate, direct, and impact surrounding communities in very devastating ways. And these can include things that we often hear about. This is a picture from Juneau, Alaska, from the Glacier Lake Outburst flood event that happened this year in August. It was one of the most, or the most devastating on record. So it can really impact communities that live very close to glacial communities, but also glacial surges, which are different ways of glacial dynamics changing. It's not only the recession of glaciers, but also in some ways their surging capacity. And sea ice in its very ways that it can have different dynamics and motions, whether it breaks out and so forth, can impact those in that maritime area. And permafrost thaw that we're often hearing about, especially in the Arctic context. So that way, local communities are very much the first to be in the hazardous and risky situations. And I think it's really important to note that we really have to make it very clear that climate change is the main driver behind these events. So what we're seeing, this is from the WMO State of the Climate Report that was just issued this week. The graph speaks for itself that temperature changes that really rise and stark change in temperature is causing very accelerated glacial loss all around the world. And to put it briefly, even in 1 year, the amount of glacial melt that we have seen is equivalent to the amount of water in the Dead Sea 5 times over. So this is a huge amount of water that's being contributed to our whole global ecosystem on a 1 year scale. For a more South American context, it's also equal to the amount of water that's discharged from the Amazon River, which is one of the largest river systems in the world. So we're talking about a very, very huge amount of water increase that comes into our whole system, is changing everything from the glacial dynamics. Regina will also talk about this in her presentation, but in Switzerland, in very high mountain areas that are also directly affected, 10% of glacial mass loss has happened in a year. So these are very large numbers to keep in mind, and climate change is really what's driving that. So as I mentioned, communities are at the forefront of the impact, but also if we look at this in terms of agency, as I was mentioning, hazards can be prevented. They are also able to be the first responders. And they often are in that role because they have to be in that role. So they're often remote locations with limited access to resources and capacity. And as I was talking about hazards, exposure, vulnerability, you add a remote location, you add limited capacity, risk therefore increases quite rapidly. So if we understand that equation, that where people are located, where communities are located, where nature is located, needs more support, it can then better also support when people need it. And with these sudden onset events, especially with bush like upwards floods and sea ice situations, time and logistics are of the essence. So these can often happen very rapidly, especially in the Himalayan context where there are debris dams, which like upwards floods, it's very much like a dam breaking, if you would think a water dam. So we don't have a lot of time once an event happens. So preparedness is a very, very important element to keep in mind. So that way, if we can really take that into context of that, we have to support communities not just at the event, but to prepare for them. We can, yeah, hopefully have better consequences from these impacts. But I think this is something that we really want to stress today in the presentation, is that this is a very dynamic process. That the cryospheric hazards that we're experiencing now will be changing in the years to come. So even communities that are, as I was mentioning, Juneau, Alaska, from 2011 has been experiencing glacial lake outflows flood every year. This was the most damaging year, right? So it's not that it's a very static way, it's very dynamic. And especially that we're going to see that it will happen in areas that have never experienced hazards before. So as our cryosphere is changing, new communities are coming under risk. Their capacity could also be even more limited. So what we're seeing now is not an example of what's to come. It will probably be much more. So the idea is that we really need to have a flexible and agile approach to make sure that all communities are able to understand their potential risk, not just right now, but in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and to work with that kind of information, with scientists, with information to understand how we can better adapt. So I will then close the introduction, hopefully leave some open questions that the other presenters can touch on. I'll be followed by Dr. Regina Mott from the University of Oslo to talk more about really what is the status of cryosphere hazards in the years to come from a scientific evaluation perspective. We will also have presenters talk about different case studies from around the world. We'll be featuring Alaska. Dr. Hayo Aiken will be talking about permafrost thaw and sea ice hazards in Alaska, as well as we have some presenters coming in and out potentially, but glacial lake outburst floods in Alaska by Dr. Aaron Mills. We also will be looking then switching to the Andes, and also in light of the future COP30 next year. It's a good way to emphasize that part of the world too. So we'll be looking at 7 decades of bluff hazard mitigation in the Caribbean Andes by Dr. Adam Younger, as well as the economic consequences of glacial melt by Dr. Randy Asmat from the University of Zurich. And I'll close with some overview after that. So I'll hand it off to Regina. So we'll just do a quick change and have Dr. Hayo Aiken come up on sea ice hazards and permafrost in Alaska.
All right. Hey, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this event. I'll be talking a bit more about the interrelated nature of sea ice and permafrost hazards in Alaska, building on Dr. Abdel Fattah's remarks, in particular, how responses at the local level are going to be an important component as we think more about climate change in future years driven by these large-scale global forcers. You see here a photo taken by Curtis Nakbuk from Shishmaref, showing the interaction between the ocean here and the offshore coastal region, and then retreating land underlain by permafrost.
Speak as loud as possible.
Okay,
Like
so
super, super loud. Yeah, thank you so much.
okay. Is that better if I lean into the mic?
Even a bit stronger would be great. Thank you.
Whoa, that's going to be a tough one, but I'll give my best. So just to give you a brief perspective here, the Arctic cryosphere includes sea ice, permafrost as well, something I'll be covering here. Key point is that in the broader context, the cryosphere provides important services for all of humanity, in particular through climate regulation, albedo, radiation budgets of the Earth driven by seasonal snow cover and sea ice in particular. Then we have greenhouse gases stored in permafrost, in particular methane. I'm not going to be touching on those aspects of the cryosphere, but they're important because they're a key element of slow onset hazards. I'll focus on rapid onset hazards related to sea ice and permafrost degradation and permafrost failure. Alaska, if you look at the top left of the map here, is both occupied roughly half of the land area by continuous permafrost. Here in Fairbanks, where I'm residing, we have discontinuous permafrost, and then the sporadic permafrost further in the south. Let's start off with sea ice. Shown here are trends in ice concentration. On the left-hand side, you see the map for winter ice concentration in March. On the right-hand side, summer ice concentration trends for September between 1979 and 2023. Again, from the perspective of Alaska, we're seeing large loss of sea ice in the Bering Sea in the wintertime, impacting ecosystems, coastal communities, major impacts, in part, for example, related to a recent crisis with respect to salmon populations. But more importantly, in the summertime, we're seeing a loss of perennial sea ice cover, opening up large ocean areas north of the state, exposing shorelines to increased wave action and warming through warm water brought directly in contact with the coast. So these impacts are major aspects of sea ice associated hazards. Let's focus on the northernmost point here in Alaska, the community of Cryospheric. I just got back from a trip there a couple of days ago. We're working closely with community experts, Inupiaq ice experts, Joe Levitt here, Billy Adams shown. They have collected observations over the past 15 to 20 years that look in particular at how ice hazards, sea ice hazards evolve in connection with human activities at the local scale. Combining that with satellite data, we can show and examine in more detail the shift towards later freeze updates here shown at the top in orange, as well as earlier breakup of the ice cover in spring. Over the past few decades, we've seen a reduction in the sea ice season by more than 2 weeks per decade. That has major impacts on a range of activities and increases exposure to hazards. Interesting is the fact, if you look at the lower curve here, you see large interannual variability in the date of breakup. That holds some promise for subseasonal to seasonal scale prediction that allows some increased preparation by the community and operators in the region for ice conditions in a particular year. This plot here summarizes some of the hazards associated with sea ice. It's something that Dure Daman has put together, who's now also working in Norway. Formerly worked with us here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. A key aspect of this is that sea ice hazards are often tied to sea ice uses. So you have a very close connection between exposure to risks and or exposure to hazards that translate into risks, as Dr. Abdel Fattah already mentioned. And I just want to highlight here, you see this vessel on the right-hand side. We have larger periods of open water, but still some ice persisting during those time periods. That actually increases the risk in the context of vessel traffic in the ice, even though we have a longer open water season. And similarly, a lot of human activities, as well as parts of the marine ecosystem, specifically marine mammals, depend on sea ice as a platform, in particular in nearshore areas. Lack of stability, the shifts in the ice season that I just showed you, also substantially increase hazards at the local scale. What do you do about that? From the local perspective, one way to respond here is to work with coastal radar data. What's shown here on the left is an image of a coastal radar imagery in the community of Utqiagvik in northern Alaska. And this is work in particular by Andy Mahoney at the Geophysical Institute here at the university, working with local experts. A group has tried to combine traditional environmental knowledge, local knowledge, and radar technology to provide better short-term decision support for the range of people who are out on the sea ice at different parts of the year. Typically in the springtime, in this community and others around Alaska, you have hundreds of people out on the ice at a particular time for subsistence harvest activities, transportation, and there's also industry uses and other commercial uses of the ice cover. So one aspect here is to increase capacity at the local scale in responding to increased exposure to hazards. And there's a clear trend towards closer collaboration with local communities. This is also the topic of the next slide here, work by Nathan Kettle, who's been working in particular with the National Weather Service in Alaska to translate some of the radar imagery and other information you see on the left into actual formal weather service and other operational agency products. But one of the lessons there is that there is a clear need for working closely with the communities towards co-produced hazards assessments and response frameworks, where you're not just bringing everything down from the agency level, but you're actually getting a lot of information that's coming up from below, and you try to find the ideal location where those two forms of knowledge and approaches to hazard assessment and mitigation complement each other. Just a few words about permafrost hazards. There's a schematic of the permafrost landscape here in Alaska. The deepening, increased penetration depth of the summer thawing layer has resulted in major instabilities in the permafrost, in particular in these ice-rich areas that we're seeing all throughout Alaska and the Russian Arctic, results in slope instabilities, increases the deepening of lakes, even leads to draining of lakes, rapid and catastrophic drainage of lakes because of increased permeability of the underlying permafrost. And in Alaska, those are key issues because if you look at the scale of the permafrost problem from a state perspective, more than 3/4 of our highways are underlain by more than 50% permafrost. More than half of our communities are underlain by more than 50% permafrost. So our infrastructure, whether it's civil infrastructure, public infrastructure, individual homes, highways, transportation systems, the railroad, everything is highly susceptible to risks associated with degrading permafrost. And in these words here by Valerie Davidson, the president of the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, all of this also translates into degradation and impacts on traditional ways of life by the 229 federally recognized Alaska Native American tribes here in Alaska. So it's directly impacting their ability to fish, hunt, and pursue their traditional lifestyles. So in conclusion, then, I just want to leave you with a few things here. As you're well aware, COP29 is looking at a broader discussion of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage that was established at COP28. We've looked at this, and you see this in the diagram here in the center of the image, in the context of the broader loss and damage framework here. How do you translate some of these exposures and vulnerabilities into actual financial response to disasters? In the US, we've had a recent review here by the Congressional Research Service that established that the US legislation is not well structured to address some of these challenges in sort of the post facto approach. And that's something where additional collaboration is required, both at the national and local level, to be able to compensate and address loss and damage here in those areas where you have significant exposure and subsequent disasters. At the institute that I lead, we take a somewhat different approach that we're working very much on a resilience-focused framework. Melinda Chase, our Indigenous Tribal Liaison here with Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, leader of the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network, she's working with a number of tribes here in Alaska to bring Indigenous perspectives and experiences, also in terms of how to effectively respond to disasters and hazards at the local level, together with the best that climate science has to offer in terms of downscaled model output, some of the observational programs, as well as some of these new tools that are being developed. So we're very much sitting at the center of the diagram here, where these different knowledge systems and tools intersect in the climate adaptation space. And I just want to close by encouraging you to look at the Northern Climate Reports. This is a project that's led out of the Climate Adaptation Science Center here at our research institute, northernclimatereports.org. If you visit the site for every single community in Alaska, for all of the 229 tribes, for any geographic location, you can pull up information that is meant to support decision makers and planners at the local level, giving a narrative of the current state of climate, future projections, but also giving you then, as you delve down deeper into the layers, here an example from Reykjavik in Northern Alaska, access to actual decision support data that you can put into any applications for federal funding requests or other types of community scale hazard assessment and climate change adaptation plans. So I appreciate the opportunity to present today and look forward to interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hayo. That was very informative, and it was a great perspective to share. Do we have any questions for Hayo from the audience that anyone would like to ask? Okay, well, you have Hayo's contact information if you want to get in touch. Thank you again. And next up then will be Regina Hawk. Great.
Just waiting for the presentation. Okay, thank you. So I will give a brief overview about glacier hazards. As you all know, glaciers are losing mass and retreating worldwide. Here, a nice example for Argentina. In a few decades, massive glacier retreat. Another example here from Alaska, also massive glacier retreat. And something new that we are seeing is that the glacier retreat and thinning is accelerating. So what we see here is now all glaciers in the world, how they are thinning, and we see a trend to more and more glacier thinning every year. On average, here in 2019-20, the glacier thinning was 50 to 60 centimeters per year, average over all glaciers in the world outside the ice sheets. And this number has really increased in the last years. These record melt years in 2023, and also this year seems to be one. How about the future? And it doesn't look much better in the future. Here you see glacier projections of all glaciers in the world for 19 glacier regions and the globe. And as you can see, one is 100% of mass now in 2015, and then projections, how much ice is left by the end of the century. And this is shown here for low emission scenario and a high emission scenario. On a global scale, we see about 20 to 40% glacier mass loss by the end of the century, depending on the emission scenario. But we see large regional differences. In regions where there's a lot of ice, especially in the Arctic, the relative mass changes are between maybe 10, 20, 30% by the end of the century. But in regions with relatively little ice, like Scandinavia, the Caucasus, North Asia, low latitude, Central Europe, we project mass losses by the end of the century between 70, 80, 90, and more percent. So almost complete deglaciation by the end of the century in some glacier regions. And this, of course, has consequences for a number of hazards, and I will show a few examples. Main implication is sea level rise. So what you see here is sea level rise during the last decades, and you see the different components. And what you see is that actually most of the sea level rise currently comes from melting ice, from Greenland, Antarctica, and glaciers. So a little bit more of half comes from melting ice. And the glaciers are a major component, even though they only are represent about 1% of the ice volume. The rest of the ice is locked up in Greenland and Antarctica. But these glaciers outside the ice sheets are major component to sea level rise. And projections show our sea level rise by the end of the century here about 0.5 meter to 80, 90 centimeters, depending on emission scenario. And this, of course, has major impacts here for low-lying islands, many of which can become uninhabitable due to sea level rise. But the projections, you see here another dash curve, these projections of about 0.5 meter to 80 centimeters, it does not include a potential catastrophic disintegration of the Western Arctic ice sheet. And that's a wild card. It's not well understood. But if it happens, then the sea level rise over the next 200 years or so could be in the order of 6, 7, up to 10 meters or more. But it's, of course, not only the mean sea level rise. What is also important is that this will increase the risk of extreme sea level events, like through stronger storm surges, increased risk of flooding, and also cascading effects like increased coastal erosion, saltwater intrusions, and so on. Also, glacier retreat can lead to more floods, has an impact on the water resources and stream flow. This is here an example from a glacier in Austria. The blue curve here during years of where the mass balance was balanced, just as much snow as melt, it was more disbalanced. And during that period, this research station was built. But just about 10, 20 years later, with negative mass balances, lots of mass loss, you see that the daily runoff peaks have increased by a factor 10. And this has led to one of here, almost the destruction of this research hut. So massive increase in daily flood peaks due to more glacier mass losses. And if this coincides with a rainstorm, then we can have really devastating floods. So there's an increased risk of floods now with this increased melt due to the glacier retreat. Another major hazard is glacier outburst floods. And the water can be dammed by the glacier and form these lakes, which then can catastrophically drain for various reasons. And if you have an ice dam and the water, so it's the balance between the water pressure and the ice dam, the ice pressure. And you can throw off that balance by increasing the water pressure with more meltwater, and that can lead to drainage of that water. It literally lifts up the glacier, and the water drains under the glacier and can lead to these catastrophic floods. Another reason, this is what we see happening now in the world, is because of the glacier thinning, the dam is no longer as strong as it was. Essentially, the dam is decreasing, and that can also throw off that balance and lead to these glacier floods. Then we have lakes that are dammed by moraines as the glacier retreats. So we have these huge moraines, water collects, The material in these moraines is not very consolidated. So once the water pressure is too high, it can catastrophically drain and lead to really catastrophic floods. Here, an example. And it's really the most deadly hazard are glacier outburst floods. There's more than 1,000 reported glacier lake outburst floods since 1900. More than 12,500 fatalities, recorded fatalities, and also, of course, a large amount of damage to infrastructure, farmland, and destruction of transportation and communication. And here's really one of the most deadly glacier outburst floods here in 2013 in India, with more than 6,000 fatalities. The latest here, just in August, a major flood, the Terni glacier outburst flood here in Nepal. It's small lakes. It was completely unexpected, led to this major outburst flood here just in August, destroying many homes, displacing residents, impacting the local hydropower. And these high water levels were even felt like 80 kilometers downstream. So massive devastation here just in August in Nepal. And glacier lakes grow. Around the world, we see more of these lakes and they grow. So there's more of an increase in the ice lake volume in the area and the number of lakes. And that, of course, increases the risk for glacier outburst floods. Another hazard, what we see is total glacier collapses. So here, within hours, essentially the glacier collapses and instability because it becomes unstable at the bottom of the glacier and led to these essentially two collapses of the two glaciers here very close to each other within just a month. And this is how it looks on the ground. How that is connected to climate warming is not 100% clear, but with more water, you destabilize the bottom of the glacier, and it's conceivable this may lead to more such events if you have more water reaching the bed of the glacier. We also have slope instabilities due to glacier retreat. Here, the glaciers essentially hold back, they stabilize the adjacent slopes, and you can have more rock fall here after thinning of the glacier. See an example from Switzerland. Another example here from Iceland, from Alaska, is here a glacier that has retreated 17 kilometers over a few decades. And what happened is it is essentially debuttressing, destabilizing these over-deepened fjord mountain walls. And that initiated then a progressive failure of the slope. And in this case, the entire slope was coming down and causing a huge tsunami. And it reached the opposite slope here, about 200 meters above sea level. This is an area nobody lives there. But if people live there, that would be a catastrophic event.
You said 200 meters.
200 meters, 190 meters up on the opposite side, the tsunami was reached. This is here, you see the devastation in the forest. Another potential hazard is release of contaminants. There's anthropogenic legacy pollutants in the glaciers. There's heavy metals, and all this can also have a potential impact on water quality downstream and impact ecosystems. So I want to conclude here. So glacier retreat impacts hazards. There's more frequent and more intense storm surges due to sea level rise. There's increased risk of melt-induced floods. There's an increased risk of glacier outburst floods, destabilization of slopes, and also contaminants can be a problem. So the impacts vary regionally on very small scales, and that means also adaptation measures, they have to be adjusted locally. Thank you very much. No questions? Okay.
Thank you very much, Regina. And we will then very nicely transition to Adam Emner from the University of Graz, who will be talking about glacial lake outburst floods in the Andes. So, yeah, thank you very much. We'll just take 1 second to load up the presentation.
This video. That's great.
Hello. Good morning from Graz to Baku. My name is Adam Emmer from the Department of Geography and Regional Science at the University of Graz in Austria, and I'm going to give you an overview of.
Can you speak as loud as possible, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I can. And could you please turn off your mic so I don't hear that?
Screaming the microphone.
Okay, once again, good morning from Graz to Baku. My name is Adam Emmer, and I will give you an overview of glove risk mitigation measures that took place in the Peruvian Andes in the last 7 decades. So this is something we have heard about today, and we have 3 components. If we are talking about any kind of cryospheric hazard, we have hazard, we have exposure, and we have vulnerability. Hazard is understood as the probability of a glove of specified magnitude. Exposure describes the presence of people and infrastructures in glove hazard zones, and vulnerability is the extent of harm to people and infrastructures. If you want to look at the glove risk, we need to inevitably look at all these components, their changes and dynamics over time. There is a long history of glove research and glove risk mitigation in the Peruvian Andes that was initiated by the catastrophic moraine dam failure of Lake Palcacocha in 1941. This is one of the most catastrophic lake outbursts in the history that destroyed the city of Huaraz and claimed at least 1,800 people. Yeah. So since that time, since 1940s, glove risk has been recognized in the Peruvian Andes, and several institutes have been established. First, this was CCLCB, later on replaced by ElectroPeru, INRENA, and most recently, INAICA. Traditionally, their focus is on hazard component of risk, but more recently, there is a tendency towards multi-hazard and multi-purpose projects. In this table, I have summarized various types of glove risk mitigation measures, ranging from hazard mitigation measures, including open cuts, artificial dams, and tunnels that are implemented directly at the dam, retention dams and flood walls that are usually implemented further downstream. Then we have exposure reduction measures, including hazard maps, relocation and early warning systems, and vulnerability reduction measures, including building codes, insurance, working on awareness and preparedness, and glove-aware critical infrastructure. Here I have a number of examples from Peruvian Andes. The first one is the open cut through the moraine dam of Lake Ishirka. So what is the purpose of this mitigation measure? To lower the lake level, which means to reduce the volume of the lake and reduce the volume of water that is available for potential flood. Open cuts are frequently combined with artificial dams, which is my second example of Lake Yaka. Artificial dams are used to increase the freeboard of the dam, preventing the overtopping of it. Some of the lakes are also equipped with tunnels. This is my third and fourth example. In Lake Tulparachu, the tunnel is dug through the moraine dam, which is technically quite challenging, while in case of Lake Paron, this is through the bedrock. My fifth example is the component. Okay, I will try to do that. Is a component of early warning system that has been installed downstream the lake number 513. And the last example are flood walls under construction in Huaraz, which are now completed. So in total, more than 40 mainly moraine dammed lakes have been mitigated so far in the Peruvian Andes, most of them in between 1950s to 1970s. Since those were quite pioneering projects, it is also important to mention some incidents that they have encountered. I would like to mention one that was Lake outburst from Lake Hankarurish in 1950s that occurred during the remediation of the dam, and it was a pretty bad glove that claimed about 500 lives. At the same time, several gloves occurred from lakes that had been mitigated, but I would see this rather as a success of the identification of glove susceptible lakes rather than the failure to prevent them, because the only way to really prevent the glove is to drain the lake completely. Here I have one example of Lake Palkakocha and the complex glove risk mitigation project. So those are all different types of measures that either are in place or are planned to be implemented. So what's the situation there? If you look at the lake, you see two artificial dams that were built in 1950s. They've been damaged several times by the earthquake in 1970 and then by the glove in 2003, so they've been rebuilt. You can also see a set of siphons. Those are used to lower the lake level, to reduce the volume of the lake, and to set the conditions for permanent lowering. The two inset pictures show the component of man-operated early warning system that had been used for several years. Those were two guys sitting in a hut at the dam, observing the lake 24 hours a day, equipped with a satellite phone. So in case a chunk of ice would fall into the lake or part of a moraine would slide into the lake, they would call the authorities in Horaz, which is 23 kilometers downstream, in order to issue timely warning for people. Horaz is also equipped with the glove hazard map, so they know where there are high hazard, medium hazard, and low hazard zones, and also it shows what are the evacuation routes in case that hazard that warning has been issued. In the second picture, you can see flood walls that were completed in 2018 and that are supposed to help navigate water outside the city center. So what's the situation now? In green color, those are the measures that are in place. So the dam has been stabilized, some flood walls have been constructed, we have early warning system, that awareness campaign, and we know our glove hazard zones. What is planned for the reducing of lake volume? The construction of retention dams in the valley is also planned. And what is not yet started is a continuous monitoring of potential growth triggers. And the status is not known for building codes and insurance. So what are the obstacles of the implementation of glove mitigation measures? I have identified 5 general issues. First, those are environmental issues. You know, the lakes are often located in protected natural areas or national parks. So any human interventions may damage those fragile geo and ecosystems. Then there are technological issues. So lakes are often located in 4,500, 5,000 meters in remote mountain areas without electricity, without the access. So it's really difficult to get the heavy machinery there to execute the work. There are economical issues. If you plan a complex glove risk mitigation project, such as one at the Lake Palkakocha, where you would like to remediate the dam, you would like to put retention dams, you would like to build flood walls, then it's of course very expensive. There are societal issues, which means that any measure for which you would not have the support from local community is basically doomed to fail. And there were several examples from the Peruvian Andes documenting that. And there are also political issues, which means that first the glove risk needs to be recognized and prioritized by the authorities in charge of disaster risk reduction, and there must be a funding Yeah. So without funding, nothing is going to happen. To wrap up my talk, Peruvian Andes are one of the pioneer regions of GLOF risk management since 1940s, 1950s. Since that time, about 40 lakes have been remediated with the use of open cuts, artificial dams, tunnels, and more recently also other types of measures. To my knowledge, there are two implemented GLOF early warning systems, one in case of Lake Palcacocha and the city of Veras, the other in case of Lake 513 and the city of Carhuas, but this one has been discontinued. There is a tendency towards purpose projects, combining retention dams for local hazard mitigation with hydropower generation, recreation, or water storage use. And the changes in GLOF risk components call for risk reassessment on a regular basis. And that's all from my side. Thank you for your attention. If you are interested in reading more of our research, you are invited to scan this QR code that will lead you to my ResearchGate profile. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Do we have any questions for Adam? It was very informative. So we really appreciate your time as well. Thank you to both you and Kayo for joining online. So we will then move now to wrapping up the session. And we really wanted to leave with some key messages for, what to take away from this, especially for those who are either working on cryospheric hazard prevention or response. Really, what's the path forward? So not to keep too much suspense, but we're going to load up the presentation and then go to that. But feel free to ask questions, or if you have anything you want to discuss, you can also say after the event. So as I mentioned, we'll discuss now what's the outlook for the years ahead. We're at a very critical junction point, I would say, in where what we can do to really support better adaptation to these cryospheric changes, but also to really push. Again, there is always agency in this context, right? So that we can also do things that can help. And one which we have already demonstrated through some of the presentations today is to really have this rich collaboration between scientists, governments, and local communities. This has often resulted in very positive experiences where everyone is learning and contributing to the process, and that increases ownership, but also the ability to have well-informed decisions. But we also want to argue that other actors should also be involved in this as well. That it's not just a government mandate or local community or a science mandate, but investments, private companies. I mean, the whole landscape is going to be affected and involved. As we saw, especially from the examples in South America, where hydropower, for example, is very closely linked to these changes. So having everyone at the table and working together is a really key part to make sure that to take this forward, that everyone has a role. And again, the local communities have to have that seat. And that's something really important to keep pressing forward and addressing in the years to come. This comes down to that point of flexible resilience, that especially with cryospheric changes, it's very dynamic. Things can happen suddenly, differently, in different places around the world. So it's not just that we should really target only the areas that are critically at risk now, but everyone that could be at risk in the years to come. That preparedness to those events that really catch us off guard scientifically are also something that will probably be on the rise, especially regarding cryospheric change. So we need to be able to increase preparedness and to make sure that everyone has the ability to respond if and when disaster occurs. And we saw this a bit already about early warning systems, such a huge impact that we could have to ensure that these are systems in place that are able to bring that message out to everyone that could be affected. And as you may be aware that the WMO has the early warning system for all initiative, but by 2027, everyone around the world should be covered by an early warning system. But we have to make sure that the cryosphere is included in that as well. So this is often overlooked, not prioritized, but it is a very much a drastic need for people that are really at the cusp, both from glacial like outburst floods, but from other types of events like that. So we can also, from the cryosphere side, make sure that this is something that's well aware for everyone around, and to work together again for that collaboration to develop these systems, make sure that they're in place. And also then about, we talk often, especially in these high-level meetings, about sea level rise and so forth. But again, those local and regional impacts are not something that is just minute or small. So we want to make sure that those hazards that are affecting people, whether it's a small community or a whole population or a whole region, this is also being argued for to make sure that this is on everyone's agenda and not just something that is on the side or something that's only to be addressed locally. We give a few examples of what we have been working on, but there's so much more to come, especially in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. This is one of the most populated areas in the world, with up to 2 billion people at risk if this glacial loss continues due to, for example, the impact on the fresh water supply. I mean, this is such a large part of the world that is really sensitive to what's happening in the cryosphere. So these kind of discussions that we had, not just on the cryosphere itself, but very downstream impacts on people, on water, on agriculture. I mean, all of life essentially will be affected. And as we've really heard very well from Regina's presentation, that sea level rise is something that is strongly being driven now by glacial contribution and ice sheet contribution. So that's also something that needs to be put on the table to discuss, that this is something that's implications for everyone around the world. So therefore, really to work together collaboratively to raise awareness about cryospheric hazards, and not just, again, on the small scale, but from the local to global. And also that the consequences have local to global impact as well. So I wanted to also then to leave on a point that it's not just something that we in the cryosphere can work on alone. That what's happening in the cryosphere, permafrost thaw, is also being driven by what's happening globally. Emissions, climate change that's being done by other factors are very much interconnected. And they have implications for places in Africa as well. So it's not just, cryosphere is only for the cryosphere, but that we're all in this together. So I hope that at least gives us a positive note to end on, and that we can at least work together on all different accounts to make sure that this is something on the table for the years to come. Thank you very much. Any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah, please.
Is it easy to find money?
Yeah, the question was, is it easy to find money for projects like this? Not always, right? Yeah. Especially now we see around the world, I mean, funding for research is getting more and more limited. So we really have to find the commonalities of where we can have the best impact across different ways. So especially for the cryosphere, I think it's important to tie it on to other projects, especially when we're looking at climate change. It's a huge endeavor. And there's other ways that we can communicate how this is interconnected, and that could open up opportunities for more research. Great question.
Do you guys have questions?
What have you? I have a question for you. What have you learned that you didn't know? Yeah.
And please, can you introduce yourself? I think it's so great that you're here. That's why I really appreciate it. What have you learned that was unexpected for you guys?
For me, the scientific base of everything that is happening, but explaining, simple words for someone like me who doesn't have any scientific background. I come from a finance background, so I work in infrastructure investment.
Sure.
So actually, we invest more on the climate mitigation side, so we invest in renewables, energy transition, but we often overlook the adaptation side, because we were saying it's not the side of climate finance where they thrive in best in the best way. I think we have to come to a sort of harvest finance. But yeah, it was interesting to learn more about a little bit the circularity of everything that happens from the global warming, the ice melting.
Yeah. But these are great discussions to be had because even if mitigation is the priority, adaptation, yeah, we'll also make sure that the mitigation is effective as well too. So yeah, I'd love to be a part of that conversation and the any information that you have and so many different angles to take it, of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you again. And yeah, feel free to stick around. Me and Regina will be here for a bit as well. So yeah, really appreciate the attending.
Thank you, everyone.